I'm Dr. Howie Jacobson, and this is the Plant Yourself Podcast. Each week, I bring you a conversation with someone who's making a positive difference in the world. And for my day job, I help leaders and their teams master their mindsets so they can achieve great things. To find out more, check out the Mindset Mastery Memo, my Substack newsletter. You can find it at plantyourself.com/memo. And now, today's show. Back with another conversation about DEI, about diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's a big topic these days because it is under attack in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And there has been a backlash to it. And I think a lot of the backlash has been caused because people who have not been marginalized have felt shame and have been asked to feel shame and have been asked to examine their privilege and do things that don't feel good. And Brene Brown said, and we quote it in this episode coming up, you can't serve while holding on to shame. And so if the goal here is service, if the goal here is to make a better world for everyone, then how do we deal with realities? How do we deal with history? How do we deal with the fact that some of us have unearned privileges, that we were born on third base with a silver spoon in our mouth, whatever? So our conversation today is with Winitha Bonney, who is a DEI expert, a consultant who comes into organizations and helps make them more inclusive, to help people belong, to help them become more diverse. And what she talks about is that the heart of it is empathy. The heart of all of this is considering how other people feel. And that's a way of putting it that takes the shame out of the equation. And I hope you really enjoy this conversation. I hope it helps you in your life, in your organizations, and I hope it helps move the idea of empathy, of just caring for each other, regardless of political differences. This caring for each other, being curious about each other, and wanting the world to be a place that works for all of us. So without further ado, Winitha Bonney, welcome to the Plant Yourself Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation. There's so much going on in the world. Yeah, so, for those of you not watching the video, that was a face. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of strides forward. There's a lot of things that look like they're moving maybe backwards. Maybe you could begin by just introducing yourself.
Yeah, so I've had a background working in corporate in a range of C-suite roles. I also have an entrepreneurial background, so I've started several businesses. When I exited the C-suite path, I then turned my attention to working primarily around diversity and inclusion. So at the meta level, it's really about change and changing culture, changing how we lead, changing how we do business. And then a lot of that work has actually focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So what in your background, your work background, got you interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion? It seems, these days it seems like it's a, redheaded stepchild to things that people really care about in the C-suite: growth, sales, profits, market expansion, global traction. What made you say, this is where I want to go and plant a flag?
I don't know so much if it was me planting the flag, but more like people planting the flag for me. So when I started my practice, I started with that work because I had already been doing that work out in the community when I was working in corporate. So I was doing what we would call social or economic inclusion work. And I was doing that pro bono for many years. For probably at that time, about 15 years. And so I already had an understanding of what inclusion diversity was. And I guess people had sort of known me, not just in my corporate work, but had known me in my community work for doing that. And so people started coming to me asking if I could do that in their corporate organizations. And so I'm a big believer in following the signs and doing the work that I've been called to do rather than the work that I think I should be doing. And that's where it started. I think the roots of it was planted a lot earlier. So for whatever reason, as a child, I had grown up watching. My parents didn't intentionally choose this for me. I would usually, switch on the TV back in the day when you turned the sort of dial, and
7 channels.
7 channels, yeah. And I watched a lot of things on the civil rights movement in the US. I think that planted a lot of seeds for me. And then I also had my own experience of, racism as a young child. And so I think those two things together then got me asking a couple of questions. And it wasn't until I moved to Canada and then to the US and started working there that I think for the first time I actually saw people that had similar skin tones and skin colors to me working in corporate. And then that really, I guess, brought it up to a much more conscious level of, hey, actually in corporate leadership, I am the only. These experiences aren't normal like I assumed they were. And I can either complain about it or I can do something about it. So I decided to come back to Australia and do something about it. And so that's kind of where all those threads came together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So were you in the C-suite before you got to North America?
No.
No. Okay.
I was in leadership roles. I was in senior leadership roles, but I hadn't quite got to C-suite yet. I was working with people, so so I guess their roles more were what you would call like vice president, so VP. So I was the right hand to them. And so because I was privileged to be in those spaces, then I was like, oh, actually, there's a lot more, there's still a lot of work to be done, but compared to where Australia was at that time, this is back in 2007. So where Australia was back then, I was like, oh, it's like I saw my color for the second time. The first time was when I was in school. I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and the second time was when I went to the States.
When you say you saw your color, what does that mean for those of us who have never had to see our color?
Yeah, I guess a difference. So I remember when I was in school, I was linking arms with my best friend. I think I was like 6 or 7 at the time. And for the first time, I saw the difference, which was she had white skin, I had brown skin. And I vividly remember that moment. I was like, oh, I have brown skin. Because I operated in mostly white environments. So unconsciously, my brain just didn't register that, hey, I'm different. I have a different skin color than the people around me. So the second time was in the US. I was actually taking a dance class, and the room was full of black and brown people, like full. And I looked around the room and I was like, oh, this room is full of black and brown people. Oh, everyone's got skin color just like me, if not darker. And I saw that, and that made me very conscious and aware of, like, in the workplace, the spaces that I had seen it, which was in the work that I was doing at the time, as well as the spaces that I hadn't seen it, which was the career that I had to date in Australia. So in Australia, when I was in these corporate environments, I didn't see a difference between me and the other people. But then when I was in an environment where I was had the opposite experience, it's like I actually saw the difference, and that was the color of my skin.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of let's say sort of, I would say, reactionary talk, but about like not seeing skin color. So people, white people are like, well, I'm colorblind, it shouldn't matter. But it sounds like to some extent that was a little bit of your experience, that you said like, oh, this, I'm not noticing, it doesn't matter. Were you like, did it not matter, or were you just not picking up on ways in which it did?
I was not picking up on it because it wasn't talked about at home. I would say we grew up in a very westernized home. In my culture, the nickname for it is whitewashed. So,
And what culture is that?
Sri Lankan. So
I don't know that term.
Yeah. Which means that, the other term is a coconut. So, you're brown on the outside, but white on the inside. So being whitewashed is same, which means like we're being washed white. So we live and breathe as a white person as opposed to our cultural identity. So that's not specific to Sri Lankan people, but it's, I guess, amongst POC, people of color communities. It's a term that's used. Some people find it quite racist, brown and black people included. And so I grew up in that environment, and my cousins would often, tease me. They would use those two terms, I'm a coconut or that I'm whitewashed. And I just didn't really think anything of it. And so, because my cousins grew up in an environment, in a community where there was majority black and brown folk in Australia. But I lived on the other side of the city. And I lived in a white community, and my parents are Christian. They're not Hindu, and so we went to a church. And so just the environment that we grew up in, we didn't talk about race. We didn't have conversations around that. And I grew up in a very white community. I was the only person of color. Me and a person called Esther. Esther was Asian. We were like the only non-white folk in our entire primary school. I remember that because we took a whole school photo, and I was like, find the Brian Brown dot, that's me. So I think when you are in those environments, you can tend to assimilate, and it wasn't until I was older, and I think particularly here in Australia, engaging more with First Nations communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, that I then started understanding the importance of culture through their eyes, through their lived experiences for myself of like, actually, what is my culture? What is my cultural identity? And asking questions about that.
So here in the U.S., I think, DEI gets simplified to everyone should have a chance. And like, so you look at the you look at the corporate website, and you look at the stock photos, and there's got to be the Asian guy and the black lady and the someone in a wheelchair. Like that's like we're all, but there's not really any talk of culture. So like it's like everyone gets to play in this westernized capitalist framework. Is like. To what extent in the work that you do and in your vision of it is DEI about just getting everyone into the same room, or are there conversations about the culture changing because of these inputs?
It's kind of like, well, inclusion is for everyone. It's just that the work looks different for everyone. So if we look at things from the context of gender and the binary lens, so male and female, inclusion actually means everyone. What it means is just the work for those that identify as men is different to the work for those that identify as women. But inherently, both people need to do work. It's just the work is different. So in order for greater inclusion and greater equity and equality to exist for women also have work. Women are not excluded from that. Women also have work to do, but it's a different kind of work to the work that men need to do. It's a partnering. It's no different to being in a romantic relationship. But there is dysfunction. Both individuals need to contribute towards unity and harmony being in existence. They both need to talk about things. There are compromises that need to be made. and so forth. When I work with organizations, we look at things from the context of inclusion as a whole, and we look at things more from the context of changing the culture. And we also look at what is the brand or the business, what do they have credibility to speak about? So not all identities and areas of marginalization are going to be relevant for organizations. I think what a lot of them tend to do is when they try and create inclusion for everyone, that's actually where they stuff up, because the leaders, the organization doesn't have that credibility yet to talk in that space or to do work in that space. There is a learning journey that needs to happen first. And we also need to look at relevancy for the brand. So what is going to be relevant for a brand, for a female-focused fashion brand? What is going to be relevant for them is women. But within women, we can then go into women, disabled women. We can go into First Nations women. We can go into Black and brown women, and women who are carers, women who are parents. We can then start to look at that at a deeper level and actually layer those things through. But I think when organizations try to create inclusion for everyone, they struggle because it's so difficult, it's so complex, it's so nuanced, and we need to actually learn the work first. And the way that we do that is we pick certain areas. We also give ourselves permission to do so, and we focus and we go deep on those areas. Once organizations go deep in those areas, and what I find is that they have the skills and the leaders have the skills to create a culture of inclusion, and then we can start to look at other areas. So one brand that I did a lot of work with, we focused on women, we focused on First Nations, and we focused on people of color, and we focused on pride. So those identify as LGBTQA plus, and two-spirited. So in that, we started with First Nations women, and then we went to First Nations women and women of color, and then we went to First Nations women, women of color, and LGBTQA plus folk. And so in that we stepped it out, and that was probably like a 2 to 3 year journey. But by going deep in one area first, then we had the skills to then start to build on that. So for me, that's how we look at culture change. And you do need to be able to really stay grounded in that, because when you focus on one area, rightfully so, other communities will speak up and say, well, what about us? But there is a skill development that needs to happen that I think community often don't realize. Because what I've seen with brands is that when they speak about anything and everything, all areas of marginalization, discrimination, that's when they stuff up. When they try to be provocative or break the status quo in a particular area, if they have some sort of experience in that space first. So I try and identify what is the space that they've already been doing some work in, and we start with that, and we go deep in that, and we build the skills, and then we start to step by step go into the other spaces.
So what you talked about, the different contexts and different groups of people have different work to do. So what is the different work that goes into these early stages of building? I was sensitized to all this around 2020 when the George Floyd murder made the news, and all of a sudden like certain jokes couldn't be made, or that, right on the heels of that, the Me Too movement, and like, a bunch of men were like, well, I don't understand the rules anymore. I don't hate anyone. I'm just joking. I'm just, where all of a sudden there were people that are just clueless, like the world is changing and I don't understand it. What is the work that goes into those early stages of saying, let's embrace a greater diversity and inclusion?
I think it's empathy. I think, when we look at, what I found is that when we look at the work of inclusion, really at its heart, it's about empathy. I think there's this, having that ability to understand other people's lived experiences. I've said racist things. I've said patriarchal things. I've said things that were discriminatory towards disabled folk. And when people have pulled me up on that, it's deeply uncomfortable because no one wants to be a bad person. There's a lot of shame around that. But what I teach people is that be thankful. Be thankful to that individual for helping you and supporting you to stand in your integrity. I think most of us pride ourselves as to be a person of integrity, to stand, live, and lead with integrity. And we need support to do that. A lot of how the brain operates is from the unconscious mind. And so we don't often see things. And so when someone brings things from the unconscious into the conscious, and supports us in that growth to stand more greatly in integrity with a deep sense of empathy towards people. I had a colleague who's also in the D&I space, and they say that what have you got to lose? Nothing. By not saying that joke, or not, it's not costing us anything. By not saying that word or not saying that joke, it's not actually costing us. But the person who receives that, it's costing them. And so a lot of the times the focus is often ourselves. I can't say this, I can't do this, I can't. So on one hand, yes, I do feel like with inclusion is all about liberation, but then the sort of, with the work of inclusion, there's a lot of paradoxical truths. There is yes and. And so yes, what the work of inclusion is about liberation. And on the other side, people do have this sense of, well, I don't feel liberated to just speak and be me because I'm always cautious and I'm fearful of saying and doing the wrong thing because I might get cancelled. So my encouragement to people is just to be you. And if someone corrects you, thank them. Keep that in mind, do your best, and move on. Like, we don't need to make a big hoo-ha about it. I've gotten friends and colleagues' pronouns incorrect, and I apologize. I can feel the shame rising. I apologize, and I move on. And that's been the feedback to me from those colleagues when I've got it wrong, which is, don't make a big hoo-ha. When you make a big hoo-ha about it, it actually makes things worse. So apologize, correct yourself, and move on. That said, I've worked across different marginalized communities, and I will say things are different for different people. So what might be acceptable and tolerable for one person might be not acceptable and not tolerable for another person. So, for example, here in Australia, First Nations folk come from different tribes and different clans, and some folk will say it's okay for you to ask what mob you're from. So what mob meaning what tribe or clan you're from. Other people will say that it's harmful to say that, and that is linked to the stolen generation. So children being taken away from their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and being put into the care of white people. And so therefore there's a loss of identity. They actually don't know who their tribe and their clan from because that has been erased. And so to ask who your mob is can be traumatic for people. So, some elders in the community will say, what they've shared with me is that some elders have said that's okay, and other elders have said that's not okay. And, and then I thought, well, then don't ask.
Uh-huh.
So unless that person chooses to share, I thought, well, this lot say this lot say that. Well, is it important? Is it important to know? No, it's an individual is an individual. If that's what they want to share from me, which is their sovereignty, if they wish to share that with me or with others, they'll share it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I feel like with the work, it requires deeper empathy. And I think with empathy comes greater consciousness and awareness. You've also got to, you've got to look at things from a place of curiosity. Like, where does that stem? Like, where does that trace back to? I think there was a museum in the States somewhere, and for Black History Month, they had in their canteen or in their cafe or kitchen within the museum, they had some watermelon salad or something like that as a feature for Black History Month, and they got a lot of hate, for that. And it's like, you need to peel back the layers, what is the connection between Black folk and watermelon? Well, it's there is a history there around, racism, and then that links into slavery and colonization. So it's really, I think the work really is about empathy. It starts with empathy. It's about having greater empathy towards others, as opposed to being concerned about ourselves. Like, I feel shamed, I'm a bad person, I can't say this, I can't say that, my voice is silenced. Having greater empathy, having greater sense of consciousness about the human existence, not just our own. And then looking at things with a sense of curiosity, knowing that just because something happened 500 years ago or 200 years ago doesn't mean that people are still feeling the effects of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, as I'm thinking about a lot of my own interactions, having moved to Spain, it's like shaking the kaleidoscope. There's a whole new set of people's characteristics that I'm fascinated by. So, when I hear different accents and I see different facial features and skin tones and heights, and I'm just curious about everybody. Right. Yeah. And so, to me, it's a sign of respect to get to know someone. Oh, where are you from? And I'm hearing that there are situations and that there are contexts in which that information maybe waits until you have developed an intimacy to even begin.
Yeah, I think So I have come to the understanding that when people ask where am I from, because they can hear an accent, and the feedback that I've gotten is that they can't pinpoint exactly where that accent is from, and then obviously my skin is brown, so people are curious, and I know that's them seeing the difference, probably unconsciously seeing the difference, but wanting to have a connection to me, so that difference sort of dissolves for them. It's maybe perhaps more of an uncomfortability for them than it is for me. But I also know with a lot of folk, they don't see things that way, and they get offended when people ask where they're from, and it's because they have this heightened awareness about their difference, and they've had that comes with a sense of not feeling like they belong. And when someone shares that, it reinforces that sense of you're different and you don't belong. You don't belong here. And so, just like that, with that awareness, it's okay. Well, even today with the Uber driver, I thought he was from the same country as me. And I was so curious about, is he from the same country as I am? And I really wanted to ask him, and we just had a conversation. I asked him how long he, because he said he shared that he had moved to Australia. I asked him how long he's been living here. I asked him, where did you live before Australia? And he said Bangladesh. And I was like, and then he said, I'm Bangladeshi. Where are you from? I said, I'm Sri Lankan. So, and then we had a chat for that. So rather than going in cold, just having a conversation. We'd already been talking for a while before that in the car. And then slowly, going into that, but having connection first, I think. Yeah.
I'm really appreciating the separation you're making between discomfort and shame. So, being in the States and watching, the corporate world embrace DEI in a, I think, rushed, clumsy, and ultimately uncommitted way, because it all went away.
Yeah.
A lot of the pushback was like, the sort of like, unconscious discrimination and unconscious bias and the feeling that was expressed by a lot of white people that I know is that we're now, you have to feel guilty, right? Like I have to, I'm diseased and I have to, cure myself of the disease. And there was a lot of pushback around that. And I think, it's certainly just from a psychological perspective, doesn't seem like a great way to get people to change. And yet, the opposite of everything's great. I have no responsibility for systemic racism, even though I'm benefiting from it. Hey, I didn't do anything, is also not moving the thing forward. And I love how you're talking about, like, when you let go of guilt and shame and you can just feel this momentary ooh and let it go, that it doesn't have to be that bad.
Yeah, shame, Brene Brown, as I think a lot of folk know, like, has done a lot of work around shame, and which is all about us, and yet we have this same tension around. We have a tension, shame and service. So on one hand, shame is all about me, and then at the same time, a lot of us have this desire to serve. And the two are often in tension with each other. But we cannot serve whilst holding on to shame. We have to let it go in order to serve and serve more fully. So, we've all inherited a legacy, and it's what we do with that legacy that matters. But inherently, we cannot. That is a legacy of privilege, and we can choose in that moment to not stay in shame, but to let it go and to step into service. Actually, how can I be of service to people? So, guilt and shame will just hold you back and keep you stuck. And that is all about us. How can we show up for others? We are humans on this, strange planet called Earth, and we cannot survive as a human race if we just look out for our own race. If we just look out for our own kind, we have to be in partnership with others, and that is a partnership of compromise, right? Just like every other relationship in our lives, it is a partnership of compromise, of shifting here, they shift, we shift, they shift, we shift, they shift, and at some, it is evolutionary, and so so I don't think I think the sort of go-to, particularly after 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement, was that there are definitely folk out there that will say, yes, you should feel guilty. My orientation is that if we are to coexist on this planet called Earth, we need to find a way to make this work. We have to function, which means you've got work to do, but also I've got work to do. So for white folk, it's actually around, well, let's understand the history. Until you fully understand the history, you don't know. And it's a history it is a legacy that we have inherited. And so we need to do something with that legacy work. In the justice, inclusion is a fancy corporate word for what this work is really about, which is social justice and human rights. And one of the key things that creates greater justice in the world, an approach to justice is what we call restorative justice. And that is a process of which two people come together to restore and to heal. So the perpetrator and the victim, if it's safe to do so, for the victim, then they would come together in a process. And it is a process of making amends, essentially. Until that amends has been made, people can't move forward. It's human psychology. But when the person makes amends, the irony is that they experience a liberation from the hurt and the harm that they have caused. So we've inherited a legacy, and it's about what we do with that. With the country that I am from, we have a similar journey. It's probably just a bit more fresh, because we had a civil war for 20 something years, and it was essentially Sinhalese versus Tamil people. So in Sri Lanka, we have Tamil folk, we have Sinhalese. We also have people that we call burghers, which are people that are Sri Lankan, but also have Dutch, Portuguese, or French or English blood in them. And but essentially it was Tamil people and Sinhalese people fighting for control of the country. And there was hurt and harm that was caused to both sides. And so the greater question for the country is, can we exist? And until amends are made to both folk, to both communities, because there was hurt and there was pain and there was suffering to both. It just, in that context. So when I look at, white folk and black folk, or white folk and people of color, because colonization didn't just happen between white and black folk, it happened all around the world. There are reoccurring, there's a legacy that's been inherited by people. For some people, that legacy has been good. For some people, that her legacy has not been good. And so, how are we coming together to, in a restorative sense, create greater harmony? Mm-hmm. How are we coming together as people to partner together so that no one feels left out? If you are in a family, if you are a part of a family and you genuinely love each and every single one that is in your family, but say you had a family of 4 and there were only 3 potatoes, would you ask for one person to miss out on a potato for their dinner, if that's all you had for dinner? No, you would, as a family, come together and you would ensure that everyone had equal parts, that everyone got fed. But the human race is exactly the same, but what we've forgotten essentially in the human race is to actually love one another. And that is also what I'm talking about when I talk about empathy. We live in, as you talked about, a capitalist society, which is me and me at all costs. And there are people that miss out. And that is a legacy that we inherit. So it's not about shame. It's not about guilt. It's actually about, with the privilege that I have, benefiting from these systems and the way that they operate, what can I do to ensure that other folk who miss out on those privileges, what can I do to ensure that they have access to those same privileges? That's got to come from a place of love. That's got to come from a place of empathy,
So this is, you said you can't serve while holding on to shame, and guilt doesn't really have a play. And yet, so if the thing I do is I post memes, right? And I don't, and but like I'm not willing to give up my privilege. Like just speaking, like I have, some inherited money that allows me to live a certain way. I have an education that gives me certain things, and I feel like I'm honestly, like when I look at the world as it is, I'm afraid to be in the bottom 50%. Right? It seems horrible. It seems scary. It's like there's not enough potatoes. And, for me and my family, like I saw a meme that's meant to be very humorous, and it kind of punched me in the face. It showed this, this very young, beautiful, carefree white woman sitting on a stoop with like a latte drink, and it says, woman says self-care is an act an act of solidarity, or engages in no other acts of solidarity. Right, like so like when I hear you talking about like sharing the potatoes among the family, that to me brings up sort of a Marxist idea of like significant redistribution, as opposed to sort of the identity politics of like differences, like you're saying, yes, there's all these differences and we have to kind of include people and be diverse and engage in justice, but at the end of the day, it's really about everyone getting potatoes.
Yeah, I mean that's the way the system operates. Is it disadvantages people based on identity. So there's so many studies that have been done. I think particularly around race, but we have all these perceptions that someone with Down syndrome cannot perform a job to a certain standard than someone who doesn't have who's not Down syndrome. So it's not so much redistribution, but looking at who is disadvantaged based on the way that a system operates, and re-engineering the system to ensure that everyone has the same access to that. The reason why people don't stand in solidarity, the reason why people don't do anything is because they are fearful of losing out and fearful of, like what you said, being in that 50%. But in my experience, no one has ever lost anything for standing up for something. We have all kept those things, speaking up. I remember I had a dance company at one point, and I remember going to Japan, and my artistic director is Zimbabwean, and he's got dreads. His skin tone is much more darker than mine, and I had a little trouble at the border, but I got through. But I saw that he was, struggling at customs. And so I could have just gone through on the other side and just kind of stood there with all the other dancers all the other dancers were much more lighter skinned than me, let alone him. But I knew in that moment, he was being questioned, So I went and I stood right next to him, and I said to him, "What's going on? How can I best support you?" So rather than me being rah, 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 actually asking him from a place of his sovereignty, not mine, how can I best support you in this moment? And he said, "Can you try and work through this?" Anyway, I did get a little bit heated, and we then both sat in in a room for a little bit. But that to me, solidarity is me willing to stay in the mud with him. Doesn't mean that, I still have my privileges. I haven't lost it on those privileges, but am I willing to sit in the mud with him? When we think about friendship, when we've extended the hand of help to our friends when they've needed it, have we lost anything? Have we been deprived of anything? For the most part, no. We still have our jobs, our incomes, our so forth and things like that. And so, fear is what often drive drives fear and greed, often drives a lot of inequality. So my experience working with different communities, also for me, trying really hard to stand in solidarity with other communities whose identities are different to mine. I have never lost any of my privilege, my things because the system is so complex, I have not lost anything. I have gained so much of being of service to others. I haven't lost anything. And I think that's all about us, and it's all about the ego. I want people to thrive. I don't want people to suffer in the world. I don't. Why should they suffer? Why should young girls be thrown into sex trafficking? Like, why? Me standing up and trying to do something to help contribute towards alleviating that. It's not depriving me of anything. And I think that's where we've got it wrong.
So another fear that I think might have something to it is if, especially working in corporate environments where in the United States there are, the legal system has set up the financial system, the corporation is a person, is a legal entity. It has obligations to its shareholders that sometimes, wipe out what you might consider ethical obligations, at least if it's not an express, B Corp or social responsibility corporation. Like it's corporate America, at least, and I don't know about Australia or necessarily the rest of the world. Corporate America has a culture, and in many ways, it's, I imagine, at odds with First Nations cultures, with Indigenous cultures, with queer cultures that may have, like if you say, I don't want people to suffer, I don't want people to live in poverty, I don't want people to get sex trafficked, that's kind of beside the point for Bank of America or Goldman Sachs, right? So is there concern that when we open up these institutions of power to people who and groups that have been marginalized, that they're going to change everything, and we're not, we're going to stop destroying the world? Like, that's a real fear, isn't it?
Well, we're evolutionary creatures. Like, we're constantly, like, evolution is a process of change. My experience is that things don't change overnight. The fear in some of the clients that I've worked with has been that I will come in and break things. My experience has been things have never been broken. They've only been enhanced. I think consumers, my experience in the research shows that consumers are more conscious. We're already seeing it with Tesla. They're conscious about what brands and their founders or the people behind them, what they stand for, and they will boycott. They will boycott brands, and they will destroy brands. They have the power to do that. We've seen it with Abercrombie and Finch. We've seen it with Victoria's Secret, which I think were both owned by the same person. We've seen it with so many other brands that seek to that have actually no longer exist because consciousness has evolved. The human consciousness has evolved. So Victoria's Secret is an example. I mean, Victoria's Secret is still around. I haven't quite checked the numbers but from when I last checked it, the revenue numbers were not as high as what they were when Victoria's Secret were at their peak. What they failed to do was first women were like, Victoria's Secret angels, yay, we love sexy women in lingerie and women that looked like that. And then women evolved, and I started asking questions of like, oh, actually, are all women like this? Is this okay? Is that perhaps the hypersexualization of women, and what are the societal impacts of women being perceived and portrayed as that? How does that impact women's sense of safety in the world? How does it impact women's sense of safety even within relationships? And so forth. And so as women's consciousness evolved and was like, oh, hang on, because in the late 80s, 90s, it was all about, part of women's empowerment was like, embrace your sexuality and feel sexy or whatever. And then women were like, oh, hang on. And so Victoria's Secret failed to progress failed to listen to women and what their needs were. And you can see that shift in women's consciousness and that evolution of that consciousness, because as women sort of change, you see this, this big hooky curve going up in revenue and then straight away dropping, because they failed to listen. There was so many other things that were going on, like a lot of sexism within the organization. I think some of the female leaders within the brand try to speak up. And so what you have now is a very different brand to the brand that they used to have. They had to change the whole company. Whether they'll continue to exist is a whole other conversation. But
yeah, well, their founder and CEO also had Jeffrey Epstein as his money manager for 20 years, which is not a great look.
Oh yeah, there was a whole bunch of things that went in. So a whole bunch of things that went on. So. Yeah, in my experience, I have a lot of colleagues that do this work. We have never seen a brand being broken by the work of DEI or putting more, in air quotation marks, diverse people in charge of these companies. What we have seen is a complete opposite. So I don't have any data to prove that. All I know is like the desktop data that I've done in terms of things that I've seen, the research, the articles that I've seen. What I have seen is brands being broken when they don't have a core sense of diversity and inclusion within their brands. If we look at,
and I guess I'm thinking, beyond brands and just capability. So I think about, like I think I can get confused if I see, a transgender spokesperson for Budweiser. I can think, oh, they're a progressive brand, when that may have nothing to do with it. But let's say a company like Boeing, which was arguably one of the greatest companies by capitalist standards in the world in terms of like what they did and the quality of, like a bunch of the same people kept kept their jobs. It was affirmative action for white people who are not that talented, and all of a sudden Boeing can't keep a jet in the air.
Yeah. I'm just going to plug in my laptop because it just said to me that the.
Oh, okay.
Apologies for that, for moving the
No
screen
worries.
around. There was a lot of blame because it was the easy place to put the blame. That there is no data around that. It's so interesting because when it comes to diversity and inclusion, people will say, where is the data? But when it comes to putting the blame on diversity and inclusion, all of a sudden data is forgotten about. So, I think that's all part of a bigger strategy around power and throwing as much into the media to create mass confusion through chaos. I think that particular situation was part of a much larger strategy. But in my experience, that is putting more diverse people into those roles. I mean, my assumption would be, I haven't worked in the Air Force field, but my assumption would be, having worked in other areas, is that it is a very highly regulated space with a very, very heavy focus on safety. So the problem isn't diversity. The problem is in the mechanics of the operation, and things like that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, my thing is where is the data to back that up? Yeah.
So when you think about the work that you do and the work that needs to be done, like where do you see it going in the next 5-10 years? Like what can we look forward to? I know there's a lot of reactionary movements right now. I'm telling myself that they're the last dying gasp of an old world. I hope that's true. Paint us a picture of a world in which like stuff works.
Yeah, I believe the future of DEI. I mean, there's a big conversation amongst practitioners around what is the future of the work. My sort of sense is like let's just sit with it for now. Let's not do like a big rebrand of the work and relabel it as something else. Like let's actually sit with it for now. I believe the future of this work is actually about empathy and us coming back to a sense of humanness about what the work is about. We live in a very globally connected world. There is, I guess, the sort of ideal future is a future where people genuinely look out for the needs and the interests of others rather than solely their own, and have a service orientation.
So we're back after some internet glitches, but I want to make sure before you go, Winitha, that you let people know how they can find you and your work, and who should reach out for your service.
Yeah, absolutely. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Winitha Bonney, Instagram at winitha.bonney. And also my website is winitha.com.
Winitha, and spell Winitha for...
Yeah. WINITHA.com. That's probably the best place to find me, to send me a message and get in contact. Right now, I'm really focusing on spreading the message via events and speaking at different corporate events and conferences. One of the keynotes that I have is called It Ain't Woke, Commercially Smart Inclusion. And that's really about resetting the agenda on the work and what it looks like for organizations, and how inclusion truly is a win-win strategy for all kinds of organizations and businesses.
Awesome. And do you do this work globally?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So maybe someone listening to this can get you to Spain, and we could meet up and have tapas. Yeah,
that would be amazing.
Well, I think it's cool that your website is your first name. That's like making you like, Cher or Madonna, like you own the brand.
Yeah, I got to thank my mother for that one, huh?
Winitha Bonney, thank you so much for this heartfelt and thought-provoking conversation, and for all the work you do in the world.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Have fun. And that's a wrap. Show notes for today's episode at plantyourself.com/621. What's going on? Movement news. Haven't done much. Had a weekend off, just exploring the old city of Girona. So did a lot of walking, but not much exertion. Coming back to the beach this morning after a podcast interview that I'm going to run. Going to do some sprinting. My trainer Jay is now throwing a football ahead of me, and I try to run in the sand and catch up to it. I get about 1 in 5 or 6, but apparently it's building good stamina. And we got the weekend grass tournament up north of Girona this coming weekend. So excited to be back in cleats on grass. And that's about it for movement. Just trying to keep things calm and steady. Other things going on. The weather's getting real nice here. The trees are budding. There's been a lot of rain in Spain this past year. It's helped with the drought, and I'm looking forward to a greener spring and early summer than I've seen so far. Hey, a thought. It's a beautiful area where I live, and I wonder if folks would be interested in a 3 or 4 day retreat around mindset, around living your best life, around removing the things that have triggered us so that we can move through life with more composure, become less flappable, more unflappable. If anyone's interested in that and coming out to the Barcelona area, staying at a nice place, getting some nature, and doing some group work on ourselves, hit me up, hj@plantyourself.com. I'm not committed to this, but if there's interest, I'd be happy to start putting things together. I used to do this quite a lot when I still lived in North Carolina. We would have these Sick to Fit retreats where people would come, maybe 6 to 10 people, and we would do really amazing deep work, eat great food, go running, go walking, connect, make lifelong friends. And I hadn't thought about doing that over here, but now I'm thinking about it. So hj@plantyourself.com. HJ stands for Howie Jacobson. hj@plantyourself.com. Drop me a line. Let me know what you think. All right, that's it for this week. As always, be well, my friends. Let's take this home with some gratitudes. First of all, thanks to Mama Earth. You have been so very, very good to me. Second, Will Ridenauer donated the use of his beautiful song Sabali Dawn as the theme music for this show. You can find out more about Will's music at willridenauer.com. Third, thanks to all the patrons of the Plant Yourself podcast for your financial support. You can read the names of all the patrons at any show notes at plantyourself.com. If you would like to become a patron to show your gratitude for the work I'm doing and help support it, you can do so at plantyourself.com/gift. That's GIFT, all lowercase. And finally, I want to thank you, the listener, for making all of this possible, for giving me a reason to reach out to people, to have conversations, to edit, produce, publicize. All the stuff that I do is for you, so that we can continue to have conversations and continue to ripple out healing and transformation into the world.